Well, I'm George Taylor, a resident of Marshalltown, Iowa, and very proud of it. I came here in 1985 as president of the bank, which is now the U.S. Bank. Retired 25 years ago. And I've enjoyed my retirement very much because I just happened to, way back in 1973, I bought a cabin in Minnesota, and that's where I spend my summers, fishing, and also working on water quality and stuff. So that's my summertime, and wintertime I come south to Marshalltown, Iowa. Most of them up there go to Arizona or Florida. I like Marshalltown, and I can take the snow. So that's my history. I tried to enlist in December of 1942. I was graduated in June of 42. And I had been working at the bank because when I was a sophomore in high school, my mother put an ad in the paper, "Strong young man wants summer work." And I didn't know that until I got home from playing sandlot baseball with my buddies. School was out. Came home at noon, and she said, "Somebody down at the Clinton Herald wants to see you." I said, "What for?" "Well, I put an ad in the paper. Strong young man wants summer work. You go down. He wants to interview you." And I go down there, and there's a farmer with shoulders about that broad in blue jeans, bib overalls, I should say. And he felt my arm, and he says, "You aren't very strong, are you?" And I said, "No, sir." And I left and went over to the kids' hangout and applied for a job as a dishwasher. And I was a sophomore in high school. And I got the job, only I didn't stay a dishwasher long. I became a waiter, and I worked for Marcuse's in Clinton, Iowa, from that time until 1942 in January. After a basketball game, we were real busy, and I waited on the president of the bank and his family, and his daughter happened to be a beautiful woman, a beautiful girl, and I was a high school photographer, and so I used her as a model quite often. And he said, "Why don't you come by and talk to me?" So I went over and talked to him. He says, "Could you arrange your schedule so that you could work from noon to 5 at the bank?" This was, well, I could because I had plenty of credits. I was the editor of the high school paper and the photographer for the annual, but I could handle that. So I started to work on February 23rd at the City National Bank in Clinton, Iowa. And that's how I got started in banking. And then I was drafted, as I mentioned. I tried to enlist, but I was drafted on April 1st of 1943. I went to Des Moines. We had 60 on our bus, and they named me the head guy on the bus. Well, that meant I stood up because we only had 60 seats, and I was number 61. And so, but we got there, they took our clothes off, and we sent them home, and then we had a physical, and then we got our clothes. From there, we went and had a better physical. Then they gave us an aptitude test. Now, this all started at midnight, and so it took place through the night. And part of my heritage was my dad, when I was a freshman in high school, said I needed a trade. So he says to me, "I've arranged for a friend of mine who's a retired station agent, and you're going to take the summer and go up on your bicycle to his place. And why don't you take my buddy Frank with you?" So Frank Parchin and I went up and became station agents, which included code. Well, part of the aptitude test was code. That's a snap for me. And out of the 60, only one went to the Air Force, and that was me. They bought me a ticket and put me on a train, and I went directly to Shepherd Field, Texas, where I was joined by probably 50 other draftees, all from the Bronx, and all in their late 20s, and all prone to drinking every night and messing up their lives. And that's when I decided I didn't need alcohol, and I've never had a drink. So there's one of the things that I'm not proud of it. I don't care if other people drink, but I'm not going to put myself in any shape like they were in. So that was the first thing. And then I discovered that they were goof-offs. Well, I became an eager beaver, and we had a sergeant who was we called him Wingnut because he had big ears. And I made friends with him, and when he needed somebody to clean the latrine, I volunteered. When he needed somebody to pick up butts on the parade ground, I volunteered. And so I became okay, and I worked hard on the obstacle course because I was a banker. I was not a football player. I was not very strong. But if somebody was after me, I wanted to be able to run or fight back. So I dedicated myself to building up my body. And then they sent me to radio gunner school at Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Probably because I had that little radio code. And so I joined 1,200 other students in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And we went to school at midnight till 6. They were running 4 shifts a day for radio gunners. They needed them badly over in Germany and also in Pacific. So that was about about 8 or 9 months, I think. But at the end of the period, they interviewed about 10 of us. Well, they were short of communications officers. And they had tried to they had too many weathermen officers. They tried to make them communications. It didn't work. So they were looking for people to go to OCS. And for some reason, out of 1,200, they picked me, probably because I was hot in code, because I could type 35 words a minute on a typewriter. I immediately picked up the phone, called my fiance, and said, "Darlene, let's get married. I'm going to be in the States for a whole year." And Darlene had been up there several times. And her dad was a preacher at the United Brethren Church in Gladbrook, Iowa. So I got on the train, came home. They picked me up at Tama at 5:30. At 6:30 we were married. 7:30 the women of the church had a dinner for us, and I went to Des Moines, the Brown Hotel, for a 3-day honeymoon, and then back, and she went with me. And she was a beauty operator, and a good one. She got a job immediately in a Fannel's beauty shop. She went in. She was the only one who knew how to do cold waves. They were new. So she got all the good ones. I got a room with cooking privileges with a delightful old couple up, and we were there until finally they had room for me, and they sent me to OCS. And I went from Seymour Johnson Field to Kelly Field for the 90-day wonder treatment. And then I went to Yale for some additional training. And of interest, my room was the room that Nathan Hale used when he went to Yale. There was a plaque on the wall that said this was Nathan Hale's room. And I called Darlene and said, why don't you come? I got her a room with an older couple, and what was her name? Doesn't matter. But the lady was going to the beauty shop that morning when Darlene first got there. Well, why don't you come along? She went along and got a job in a beauty shop that morning. And it was with all Italians, and she was not Italian, but they loved her. And she said, well, I don't even have a license. And the owner says, we'll sneak you out the back door when the government men come. And so she had a job, and we had a great time, and I worked hard. I was used to it, I guess. And one thing we enjoyed was the mess hall was converted. The party room, the ballroom for Yale was made our mess hall. And there was an orchestra pit above where we ate. And the Glenn Miller band, Darlene and I loved Glenn Miller, we danced a lot, enlisted 100% at once. The whole band enlisted along with Glenn Miller. And they were getting ready to go overseas. Well, every noon for about 2 months, we had Glenn Miller for lunch. And that's one of the highlights of my time at Yale University. When I got my commission at Yale on November 7th, 1943, they sent me down to Apalachicola, Florida. No, not Apalachicola. They sent me down to Boca Raton, Florida, to radar school. It was airborne radar, so I spent a lot of time flying in B-17s with the equipment, and also training. After we got there for a while, I would be training the operators that were going to fly with it. And I did quite a bit of flying in B-17s at the time. And the rumor around was that when you're near radar, the radar waves will make you infertile. And I didn't like that idea very well, but I didn't think about it much. My wife was down there with me, and that was our honeymoon because we hadn't had much time. And I'd go to school at 6 at night, and get off. I go at 6 and get off at midnight, and I bought a $300 Indian motorcycle that I used for transportation for $300, and it burned more oil than it did gas, but it worked, and we had more fun with that motorcycle. And I built a buddy seat for Darlene on the back, and it had big saddlebags, and we'd fill it with oranges and things when we were in an orchard somewhere. So it was good transportation, and I sold it for $325 when I left. But the rumor was around. Well, it wasn't a rumor. It was a statement that radar waves will make you infertile. And it bugged me that could do that. And so I forgot about it. And in March, I was given a 5-day leave to take Darlene home, and then I left for Okinawa. I ended up in charge of a radar station on Okinawa that had most powerful radar ever built. Serial number 1 was on Hawaii, serial number 2 was on Saipan, serial number 3 was on Okinawa. I joined my outfit, the 305th Fighter Control Squadron, in Seattle, Washington. They were from the East Coast, and I joined them as a second lieutenant, a low man on the totem pole. at Seattle, and we went overseas to Hawaii for about, maybe 2 months staging, and then we took a zigzag route with a convoy to stopped at Inuitak, and then we ended up in Okinawa. And I ended up in Okinawa I was a junior officer. We had 40 enlisted men, and they dumped us out on the beach, climbed down the cargo nets, and said, make a camp. And since I was a junior officer, I was the guy that had to make that camp. And we built a camp. The atomic bomb was dropped 2 days after I got there. So in essence, the war was over. After we arrived at Okinawa, we had our first typhoon, and I told all the enlisted men, the officers all went up and lived with the Marines. I was a junior officer, so I got to be with the enlisted men and take care of them. And we couldn't even drink the water. We couldn't even wash our hands in the water. We didn't even have any water. So I got a phone hooked up to some wires that I saw on the ground and got a hold of a supply depot, which happened to be within a quarter of a mile, which was good. And I asked for a water trailer and for sea rations. We didn't have anything to eat. And of course, then the typhoon came, and we stowed everything under our tents and threw sandbags on top. It had been a Japanese revetment gun place, so we had the weight of keep the tents from blowing away, and our gear was underneath our pup tents. And we went over to a hospital, a field hospital that had 4 tents and 40 patients in 2 of the tents, one for leaving the area for the nurses and the crew, and the other one for equipment. And we helped save that from being blown away by loosening the tent ropes. They had tightened them all up, and once you get the rain and the shrinking, they'll pull the tent stakes right out of the ground. And so we saved I won't say it, but we saved them. And we kept the tents up. We put about 10 men in each tent, and we were really appreciated for doing that, because it would have been a disaster if those tents had gone down with all those patients. So and we made friends, which helped, and they were close by. And I survived 4 typhoons in 2 years on Okinawa. And the winds we're having today, nothing like the winds you have in a typhoon. Our enlisted men had some radio experience, but we became the guys that ran all the radio equipment. We had all kinds of radio equipment because we had VHF with the pilots that were flying around and so on. So we did a good job. We had 14 officers. They were the controllers that looked at the panels, and we had a guy that wrote backwards on a big, huge plexiglass map so he could plot the flights. And we got several, I'm not going to tell you all the things, but we got several accommodations because we were connected actually with, in fact, we worked with the Air Sea Rescue. And I've got some pictures of the first helicopters. We called them egg beaters because they weren't much bigger than an egg beater. And we had a Dumbo. Nobody knows what a Dumbo is, but I do. It's a B-17 that's got a droppable lifeboat hung underneath. And one time later on, they were moving a flight of B-50s from Saipan to Japan for occupation at the Japanese airplanes. We were going to put our airplanes on their airfield. And Captain Kelly, one of the controllers, says, "George, why don't we put that Dumbo out there about 400 miles? They're going to pass through our control area. They're known for ditching because they get engine fires all the time." So we did that. And lo and behold, one went down. They ditched. And the next morning, the pilot came in. "Who had that droppable lifeboat out there?" And I says, "Captain Kelly. He's right over there at that scope." And he went over and he says, "Captain, I want you to know I didn't even get my wristwatch wet." And that made us all feel good. It was his idea, and it was, I don't know whether it was premonition or what, but we knew that B-50s, B-29s they were then, could sure fall out of the air. And I was there for 4 years. No, 2 years, a little over 2 years. Declared essential 4 times because we didn't have anybody to run it. They started bringing civilians over with their with the enlistment. Naha it's still an Air Force base on Okinawa, and it's got B-50s there right now. And Naha is a control area for Japan and for most all those. We still have the Americans run the air traffic control for them, so they're still there. Anyway, we came. I decided that I would not tell Darlene when I was coming home until I was on board the ship. And I had one of my guys who was a ham radio operator in civilian life. I said, "You fire up one of our BC-610s on a ham band and send it to Clinton, Iowa. There'll be a ham there. I'm sure there's ham radio guys there." And in my history, I've got the notice from the ham radio noting that I was going to leave on such and such a date on a Marine jumper, and I expected it to take about 14 days. And I said, "Now, when I'm on board ship and gone, you send that." And he did, and she got it, but it was more than 14 days because we got a troop train, and I ended up in Chicago. She was in Chicago about 10 days early, but that's all right. And when I got in there, I was a first lieutenant. They talked me into signing up for the inactive reserves. I knew that Russia did not disarm. Okinawa was close to Russia. And we would meet with the staff about once every couple of months just to evaluate what was going on in Russia. So the guy that was checking me out, he says, "You know, you're a first lieutenant, you're 21 years old, and you're worried about Russia, aren't you?" And I said, "Sure am." "You know, you could be drafted." And I said, "What do you mean?" "Why don't you sign up for the inactive reserves?" So I said, "God, what's that?" "Well, you don't have any active duty. They probably would never call on you. But if they did, they'd call on you as a first lieutenant, not as a private." And I said, "Well, I guess it's worth the risk." So that's when I got home, and as I told you, radar does not make you sterile, because our first daughter was born exactly 9 months after the day I got home. And she's a beautiful gal, and I've got 3 kids, 9 grandkids, and 13 great-grandkids, so I'm blessed. But September 10th in 1950, well, in March, I had received a letter from the Air Force saying, what rank would you be willing to be put back on active duty? And major, I'll take care of that. And never heard from him until September 10th of 1950. I had 10 days to report for active duty. And I had just bought a house. My second child was born. I was less than a year old. And I had to go, I had 10 days to report to Shreveport, Louisiana, in the 305th Bomber Squadron, SAC, Strategic Air Command. And I go down and I report, and they say, well, you're another 0141. We've got 14 on the base, and I have a TO&E for 3. And I said, good, I'll go home. And he said, no, you'll go to the BOQ, register, and watch the bulletin board. Now, they rush me back, do that, and then say, go up and sit in the BOQ, or the Officers Club, until we find something for you to do. Well, my neighbor at the BOQ was a Philco Tech rep named Mike Nushko. He was a Russian. And he was teaching electronics to about 35 enlisted men. Well, between the 4 years I'd been out, we'd gone from vacuum tubes to transistors. And I'm a banker. And I decided I better sit in on that. So I monitored that course for about 2 weeks. But the second week on Tuesday, a bird colonel came in and sat down beside me. And he said, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I've been recalled and I need to find out what's going on in the electronics business. And he took my name and I didn't think anything about it. Well, that was on Tuesday. And on Thursday, I got a call from to report to the commanding officer of the wing, 305th Bomber Wing. And it was Colonel Wade, the guy that sat next to me. And he calls his exec officer in and he says, Lieutenant Taylor, we have a top secret bombing device that you're going to be in charge of a squadron that's going to install them, check them out, and take them over to Europe. And I said, oh, I'm a banker. But when he asked, he told his exec officer, give Lieutenant Taylor anything he wants. I want Mike Inesco to be my first man in my squadron. He had the brains. And not only that, he had 30 guys that he'd been working with. And they estimated we were going to need about 30 enlisted men. And then they dropped a bomb on me and said one of the officers who developed this, they use SHORAN. SHORAN is short range aid to navigation. It's just like LORAN, only it's short range. And so they send out radio waves, and you can square them off, and you know right where your plane is. Well, he is major feared, and problem was he was an alcoholic. That made it rough on me because I don't drink. Luckily, I don't drink. And I nursed him out of some problems. But anyway, he was in charge of training, and we put this equipment on one squadron of B-50s. And we had a ground station in Abbeville, Alabama, and Apalachicola, Florida, and in Shreveport. And we used the bombing range in the Gulf for training our bombardiers to use this equipment. And everybody was amazed how accurate it was. And we did that by the 1st of March or April. We had the planes lined up. The pilots on the squadron were called lead crews. They were paid $100 extra because they were going to be carrying the atomic bomb. We arrived in Lakenheath, England, which became our base. And they were building a fence, and the English were building post holes with a post hole digger. And we had the atomic bomb, and we wanted the fence to build a little faster. And so we lined up a Jeep with an auger on the back, drove over and started pumping holes, and the whole English people that were working walked off the job. And we got that fence built in about 2 or 3 weeks instead of 4 months. But all those English people were mad because they had a job. They weren't used anymore. So anyway, we got that done. And then we had to put ground stations over on the east-west border. We needed we needed those to send out the waves that guided the bombers. So I was sent over with special orders to the general of the 8th Air Force in Wiesbaden, Germany. And I didn't report to a second lieutenant. I reported to the general because this was important. And he called his exec officer. They always have somebody that does their work. And he says, I want you to give Lieutenant Taylor a car, gas coupons, get him a German driver's license, and give him all the maps he needs. And we had put those 4 ground stations along the east-west border, specifically longitude and latitude, right where they're supposed to be. The planes had the targets, so logistically, and they were set to go if Russia ever started any action. And I went over there and the first time I spent about a month. And all I had was a .45 and a briefcase and a couple pair of underwear and some socks and maps. Couldn't speak German, but I did discover that if you were in trouble, almost every little community had a police station. And almost every one of them had someone who could speak some English. And that became where I would get information to find these places were way up in the mountains. Some of them, they were not where anybody could see them particularly. And it included a 6x6 truck and a Quonset hut for the equipment and the sleeping quarters for 4 men. And then I'd go over and check all the equipment. And I had the authority to stay in any base, English or American. And my orders were, I don't know what they were, but they were effective. And I stayed, one of the places I loved to stay was Buckyburg, which was in English. And when I showed them the orders, well, all of a sudden I'm a big wheel. I'm a first lieutenant, but I had a lot of responsibility. And so they assigned me what they call a Batman. And I don't think they do it anymore. But every officer has a Batman that shines his shoes. And so I had a nice young man who was my Batman. And he'd make sure I had breakfast in bed, and I'd lay my clothes out, and he made sure they were washed and ironed and pressed for when I go back to work in the morning. And I loved to stay at that place. I learned to play push the halfpenny. You go to the bar, and they polish a halfpenny down so it's smooth, and then they put like a game board at the end, and you have to push it like you would regular.
Shuffleboard.
Yeah. And so you push it with your thumb and try to win. But I learned to play that. And so anyway, that basically is the theory of we were assigned a hangar at the base where all of our equipment was. And that darn Major Faird, it was cold, and he had been out too late the night before, and he took a 5-gallon cast can. We were just using part of it, and he takes that gas can and puts it around in that hangar, then he lights it for heat. And I said, "My God, you could blow us up." I caught him in bed with some gal, which he would have lost his commission, and he was a womanizer, and I felt sorry for his wife. She was a Red Cross girl that married him over in North Africa when they were in North Africa, so she asked for it, I guess. And they had a baby who was handicapped pretty bad. I felt sorry for him. But anyway, that's basically my story of being in twice. And both times, I think I did a job that I worked hard at it. I tried to do my best. And especially when I was recalled, I think the Russians knew what we had. And I felt sorry for the lead crews because they were directed to drop their bomb from 35,000 feet and keep on flying and ditch somewhere out because you didn't have enough gas to get back. And so that's where they're paid $100 extra a month, I guess. But we never had to do it. And I think maybe I helped make sure that we never had to do it because we were a deterrent, and I swear they knew we were there. I was all the way from Bremerhaven all the way down past Wiesbaden. We had those 4 stations, and they were ready to go. And on Thanksgiving, I was just getting back, and I didn't even know it was Thanksgiving. And I went to the officers' club, and it was closed. And they said, what do you want? I said, well, I haven't had anything to eat since the sandwich at noon. We've got a turkey dinner for you. And so they entertained me. And I decided I wanted to buy myself a Belgian Browning shotgun. Well, I mulled that over in my mind. It was almost Christmas time, and I had a wife that was a great gal. I was going with a high school student by the name of Barbara Owen. She was a nice girl. I'd been dating her probably almost 6 months, maybe. And one of the girls at the bank got on the train, and I was going to Boone on the same train to see my sister and some of my buddies from Boone that I still had. And so anyway, when I got on the train, you know, they had these seats that push back so you can seat 4 people, 2 across from each other, the old car coaches. Well, I got on the train, and Virginia Bornhoff, who worked at the bank, said, George, why don't you come and sit with us? Because there was 1 seat left. Well, lo and behold, guess whose seat was left? I sat across from her. She was beautiful, and I believe in love at first sight. And there happened to be a China factory right near Wiesbaden. And I went over and visited with a nice young lady that knew some English. And I ordered her a 12-piece setting of China. There's a special name for it. It's really elite. And all the plates, all the cups and saucers. And I sent it home on a bomber back to Shreveport. And then I had one of my buddies, Eric express it back to Clinton. And I have a picture in here of my 2-year-old son helping my dad open the Christmas present from Dad in Germany. And Darlene always said, David's going to get that set of china. And she says, and then I got a note back, oh, she thought it was really beautiful. It is. And she said, could you get some soup dishes? We need some platters. And how about a couple of covered dishes for vegetable dishes? Well, I had another trip back to Wiesbaden. So I took her list with me, and I got all the stuff she wanted and had it shipped back to her. So it's a complete set. And my son just moved it from Estes Park to Texas. And they appraised it at $5,000 for a set of china. It never had a chip. But the movers wouldn't let him pack it. They had somebody come in and pack it specially. And this is a letter from my father to his future in-laws. And it's dated in Ames, Iowa, August 12th, 1905. Mr. and Mrs. George Schaefer, Fraser, Iowa. Dear friends, as I cannot leave my work to come and see you, I wish to ask you for your daughter, Ethel Taylor, to be mine the rest of her days. There is no date set, but we will not be married till the house is furnished and she will have a home of her own and will not have to live with my folks. Mama and Papa have given their consent, and I will do all they can for us. Yours respectful, Charles Taylor, Jr. And that's my father asking my mother's parents for her hand in marriage on Chicago Northwestern Stationery. Well, the war was over, and I made a deal with the reconnaissance squadron that I would do all of their personal photographs if they would furnish me with the film and the chemicals and the paper. And I took a projector for aircraft identification use. I made an enlarger out of it. And I had the POWs build me a darkroom. The only restriction I had was, number one, if I saw a picture that I wanted, I could make a copy for myself. But I didn't charge them anything because they furnished everything. And it worked out real well. I always kept 2 bottles. I give the liquor to my top sergeant, and he'd make a mix, for we'd have picnic on the beach about once a month. Anybody that wasn't working, we would get down and we get some stuff to eat and crackers and cheese and stuff. And then he would always make a punch using my liquor. But I always saved a couple back. Well, we found this place that really needed to have. We didn't have any roofing, we didn't have any plumbing, we didn't have any electrical, we didn't have anything, no plywood or anything. And I borrowed the biggest 6x6 truck that I could. It was a huge military, one of the biggest 6x6s. They were the big ones. And I had 6 PWs. And I took a sergeant with me who was supposed to be guarding the PWs. They were happy. They didn't bother us at all. They were getting fed. They had a good place to sleep. But anyway, so I get this big old 6x6 and we go over because they were just bringing lumber from the United States to build housing for the enlisted men and officers that were going to be at Naha. Well, I went over to the lumberyard, and I said, we don't have any place to stay. And this old chief, I don't know what he was in the Navy, he said, well, you'll have to get down about a quarter of a mile. There's a Quonset hut. Go down and get a work order and list what you want, and come on back and see me. Well, I did this. I had a bottle of booze under my flight jacket, one on each side. I went like this. And he says, the paneling's there. And we filled that big truck up so full that the front wheels went off. And I put 2 PWs on each one of the front fenders. But that's how we got 2 bottles of booze, and we probably got $10,000 worth of lumber. And, when I came back from the service, Darlene wanted me to go to college because I didn't have a chance to go to college. Well, I wanted to have a family. And so finally, Bruce Townsend, the president of the bank, says, George, you can go to college and you can learn psychology and you can learn a foreign language and you can participate in the arts and you can get all that stuff. It's really important stuff. But you come to work for me, I'll make you a banker. And he sent me to the Graduate School of Banking, the Graduate Trust Office School. The Graduate School of Banking was a 3-year course up at the University of Wisconsin. 2 weeks residence for 3 years, plus all the homework. And I've got all the paperwork that I did downstairs, and our economics professor became the head of the president's finance committee or whatever it was. And he wrote across that my final paper, excellent. And I saved that for my son because he went to the banking school down in Texas. When I was transferred to Boone, Iowa, I was a new president of the Citizens National Bank that Hawkeye had just bought. And as a native from Boone, I left there when I was in 9th grade. I had some old friends there, some of the kids I went to school with. And my dad and I, when we lived there, he knew every railroad man, so I would sit in the lobby and somebody would be wandering around out there and I'd go out and say, could I help you? And he'd say, are you Charlie Taylor's boy? And I said, yeah, I am. Well, your dad was a great guy, you know, and the only time I ever heard him curse was when we were on a way freight. We stopped at Fort Dodge. We had a big box to unload. It took two of us. And it was in a boxcar. And so he got on one end and I got on the other, and we lifted it up and took it out and settled it on the siding there, and he got shit all over his hands. And he says, shit, human shit. I can't believe it. Some hobo had gone in and did his job in the car and left it. And he set that box down in it, and then when he picked the box up, it got all over his hand. He says, that's the only time I saw your dad really, really mad. But he never swore. He was just a quiet, good conductor. So that was one of my first exposures to Boone. And then I found out that Mamie Eisenhower's Uncle Joel was a cashier of our bank, and that Mamie came on his birthday every year. And so when I first met her, she just arrived with her 6 super service people taking care of her. She couldn't fly because she had an ear problem that kept her from flying, and many people thought when she'd get dizzy or something, they thought, well, she's drinking, and she never drank. But anyway, I met Mamie Eisenhower, and she was there to see Joel, and her birthplace was right next door to a church. And a bunch of us got together because the church was going to tear it down. And a plumber and I were the catalyst to try to save Mamie Eisenhower's birthplace, because he happened to have a lot across the street from it. And so we organized a program, raised some money to do that, to move her, and we hired the same architect that was used, they were used to do the governor's mansion in Des Moines. So it was well done. He did a terrific job. I knew that the Eisenhowers were Bob Hope was a good friend of theirs, and so I wrote a letter to Bob Hope and says, we're restoring Mamie Dowd Eisenhower's birthplace in Boone, Iowa, and I wondered if you'd like to give us a check. I got a $1,000 check back, along with a letter that said, I'm going to be in Spirit Lake for their fall program at the park, and I'm the featured speaker. He says, could you arrange to come up and we could visit about maybe doing a fundraiser for the Eisenhower birthplace? So my wife and I went up and had a hard time convincing the people that we were allowed to see him, but we finally gave the letter to him, and then they came back and said, well, you're going to get in his trailer that he's going to be sitting in, waiting to go on the air or go on the program. So we got in and waited, and then they pulled the trailer out on the parade, out on the park ground, and we sat beside the bleachers. And the first thing that Bob asked of my wife, do you like my tie? And of course she said, it's great, it's got lots of color. I remember she said, I like colored ties. And so we sat down and we visited back and forth for, well, it was almost 2 hours. And the local newspaper came in and took a picture of us. And when they opened the program, they played the national anthem and had guns go off. And Bob Hope stood at attention and saluted while that little, and we were behind we didn't see anything, but that's how dedicated he was to this country. Even though he had never been in the service, he was named by congressional action to be considered a veteran of World War II. And that little card means a lot to him. And we got a Christmas card from he and Dolores for several years until he died. The last one was in 1999, and he passed away. But I had seen Bob Hope and his program. He always had beautiful girls with him, especially on Okinawa. I saw him twice over there, and I saw him once in Texas. But he had a bunch with him that were really pretty, and of course the GIs just loved him. And I had dinner with him, not with him, but in the Officers Club in San Antonio a couple of times when he was down there, and I was down there for a brief time. But he was an amazing person, and he had a sense of humor. And he always took 2 hours before he went on program. And he would, I suppose, meditate, or at least plan his program. And he would always take 2 hours before he was on the air or in the performance. And he would decide what he's going to say. And he didn't use any notes. He was an amazing person. And his wife was a showgirl. And Dolores was really pretty and full of life. And I'm sure they had a good life together. I don't know how she put up with him, but he was a great guy. And I'm pleased to have gotten to know him. Darlene and I really enjoyed the relationship we developed in one day, and then the 3 days he was in Des Moines for the program. So my wife died about 7 years ago, and I'm sure she's up there saying, "George, we sure had a good life together," and we did. She followed me in when she could, and she was a great gal.